Hello, the cabin.
By golly, there he is. Gerry, my friend. Long time.
Long time indeed, sir. You're
Does
looking
my heart
well.
good to see you.
And likewise mine. You're looking good. You wintered well.
And you, sir.
Indeed.
Chilly morning.
It's cool. It's that time of year, but yeah.
Let's warm you up by the fire.
That sounds great. Thank you.
It's a wee bit warmer here, Gerry, for you.
Feels nice.
Let me take your musket.
Certainly,
Maybe you could
sir.
throw a chunk of wood on the fire and I'll get that door closed. Someday real spring's coming.
Yeah, indeed. The birds are all back, so they know something we don't know.
Excellent, excellent.
Oh, that feels nice.
We'll get a cup of coffee going here and warm your old bones. They're almost as old as mine.
Oh, some days they feel older, I'm sure. That was a good cup of coffee.
Man, most people drink my coffee, say it's a wee bit strong. Anyway, I would like to introduce Gerry Neilands. Gerry's kind of a walking encyclopedia of many aspects of the 17 and 1800s, but I'm going to say his forte would be trade silver. He's like a friend of mine, Nathaniel Kilbuck, down in the States, who has the Buffalo Trace. I think every waking hour that you have free, you must be researching something. In addition to that, Gerry has a Facebook page called Portraying Natives of the War of 1812. And I find it fascinating, some of those tidbits of history that you post on that site. I take it, run with it. I don't have to do the work. I just sit back and Gerry does the research for me.
Thank you. The research is all there. Our ancestors left us a lot of information. All we have to do is take the time to find it and read it.
Find it, there you go. Anyway, Gerry has put out a display of trade silver. I'm pretty much going to turn it over to him. I'm going to learn a lot this morning, and I hope you enjoy what Gerry's got to share with us today. Shall we have a look at the display?
Certainly.
This is absolutely amazing, Gerry, and I think what a lot of us, or you're going to share today, is how significant a role trade silver played in the early trade with Indigenous peoples on this continent. We're going to get, I know you, just from the display, I can tell you're going to get into a lot of other things other than just trade silver, like material items, wool blankets, but shall we start with trade silver and you can
Sure.
teach away. I'm a sponge for listening.
Well, thank you. Yeah. One of the first things that was traded or given to the First Nations people around the time of contact was a lot of jewelry items. The Jesuits often would entice some of their native friends with what we refer to as Jesuit rings. So rings, small crosses and so on, medals and that sort of thing. As trade progressed and the Europeans found out what the native customers wanted, or their native friends and allies, they soon became focused on those things. Of course, like any culture, the native culture also had higher ranking individuals and lower ranking individuals, wealthy individuals and so forth. So in that regard, when you were establishing trade relations, you wanted to focus on the chiefs first.
Impress them.
Impress them, and in that regard, you often saw some of the bigger items like armbands and the gorgets, often engraved with the royal cipher or sometimes an effigy of perhaps a clan member's effigy, a deer, and so on.
Just before we move on to that, Gerry, it's probably worth noting that we're looking at these Jesuit rings. Because there's sort of an evolution as this trade's taking place, right? So we're talking 1600s. We're talking
Yes.
Champlain.
Early.
And the Jesuits going into Huronia and
Yes.
meeting the Huron people and the Algonquins. So this is 1600s, and now we're moving more into 1700s.
Time has progressed. You've got New France, so you have French Canada, and you have the British
in the colonies.
On the colonies. But of course, the desire for furs and trade was very competitive, along with the Dutch as well in Albany and in New York and so on. So you started to see a real focus on silver. Silver being recognized as something pure, and anyone familiar with native culture will understand the significance of the positivity and negativity that exists anywhere. And so just like many Christians will wear a cross for good luck or for protection, a lot of the native individuals saw silver and wore it not only for its looks, but for its protection from the outside energy around us.
You can also draw in any example we talked about at one point about smudging and the purification of this very symbolic cultural thing that was done by most nations. So in comes the purity of silver.
Yes, certainly. If anyone that is familiar with smudging, you draw the smoke to your face, have your eyes, your nose, your mouth, over your ears, hoping that you'll be free of any negativity or bad energy and so on, and of course to your heart. And just like that, you have things like silver ear bobs, or silver earrings, silver ear wheels. Anybody familiar with the dream catchers? The silver ear wheels help protect or catch any negative energy that you might hear, bad birds and so on and so forth.
You don't want to hear the evil.
Exactly. And you don't want it entering your mind to corrupt you or whatever. And of course, it's circular. The significance of the circle has no beginning and has no end. So it's recognized as we know the world as being round.
Mother Earth, Mother Spirit,
Grandfather Sun,
of life.
Grandmother Moon.
Right.
And again, it just is something that is recognized as not only a piece of jewelry, but for the very reason of helping a person stay straight and true. So even things like the gorget, and the gorget goes back a long time, medieval times, maybe earlier, and it was a piece of the armor to protect the throat and the neck area. And over time, when of course the knights in shining armor vanished, it was kept on as a sign of rank, as an officer's rank.
Right.
And you can see this one has got the royal cipher engraved on it.
Right.
So things like this and the large armbands were given to chiefs and principal men, high-ranking warriors and so on, as a sign of their status.
The other thing you brought up, so this is sterling silver, which was the coup de grace in the trade world. But some of the silver we're talking about, such as the armbands that you showed, they're not sterling silver. Well,
that's a good point. Now, sterling silver, of course, unlike a copper or brass-based material, won't turn your fingers and
your
things
hide green.
So what some of the more not so fairly business-like silversmiths would try to pass off what they called washed or plated silver. And that is basically, today we would know it as German silver. So it's copper, more or less copper based, with a coating of silver over top or some other metal. Yeah, sterling silver, of course, much preferred.
You shared a story with us about a trade that the natives weren't very happy with, and decided to, the next season when they came into the trading post, to get revenge for the way they'd been treated. And it actually involves plated German silver. Yes.
There's Detroit area, the region was a huge trading center where it was situated between the lakes and so on. And so quite often every year when the natives would bring their pelts down and so on to trade, they also brought maple sugar as well. Well, there happened to be a particular trader, his name was Thomas Boucherville, and he wrote some of the things that he saw and witnessed during his time just prior to the War of 1812 in that region. And one of them, as you mentioned, consisted of a group of natives that had come from western Michigan down to the area to trade. And of course, there's everybody and their brother were trading, and this particular silversmith by the name of Lefert, I believe his name was, he traded a bunch of silver and other items for this maple sugar. And then, of course, what he traded was washed silver or plated silver. So when these natives went back up, hey, what's the deal here? Turning my clothes
my hide's going green.
My ears and so on. So the following year, they came down again, and Boucherville met with them, and he knew, they told him what had happened the previous year. And he, oh, there could be trouble. But the chief that he talked to, nope, they've got it covered. It's okay. And as a result, they went to trade with this Lefert once again. And they did, and they came back to Boucherville, and they said, everything went good. We're going to be on our way. And Lefert came past Boucherville later in the day with 1,500 pounds of maple sugar in birch bark baskets and trays to take to Fort Malden to sell to the military. And that's exactly what he did. But what happened when he got there was the commissary, head of the commissary, he checked the sugar for quality, of course. And unbeknownst to this poor trader Lefert, who had swindled the natives the previous year, they had filled the trays with sand and put perhaps an inch of maple sugar on the top. So when the commissary agent cut it open to see the quality, he took a mouthful and he found it to be more sand than sugar.
That's a great story.
So Lefert came back to Boucherville and was just quite beside himself, but well, what could he do?
A little revenge on the part of the natives. Yeah. These items, Gerry, I find pretty fascinating. So they were called moons. Mm-hmm. And what was the significance of them?
Well, much like the ear wheels, because they're circular, they represent or stand out in a lot of native cultures, as we mentioned earlier, the earth and the moon and the sun. Grandfather sun and grandmother moon. Mm-hmm. So of course they recognize that nice on a full moon it's nice and shiny, just like this is nice and shiny. And where it's worn on the chest, it's covering again. Now it's protecting any negativity from the heart, in the heart area and your chest area. And again, many had different configurations or diagrams on them. Mm-hmm. Some again had effigies, so that's a clan effigy of the Crane clan that we see up in the Sault Ste. Marie area, Central Great Lakes.
That engraving is incredibly well done.
Yeah.
So while we're on significance, I'll put out my humble contribution to Gerry's exquisite table, but I like to dabble at different crafts and decided I'd try tray silver myself. So as my first and only piece, but so it's a Saint Lorraine cross. Now the significance of that one was with the Anishinaabe Ojibwe people, and you might talk a little bit about the significance of the dragonfly.
Yes, it's seen as being representative of the dragonfly, which of course has 4 wings, and in a lot of the cultures the dragonfly is what is referred to as an old ancestor, one of the ancient ones.
Flyers.
One of the ancient flyers. And probably because they were so good at eating mosquitoes.
That's why I think they like them.
Anything.
They eat a lot of mosquitoes. They're my friend.
But it became readily, it was recognizable, and much like other things, we haven't just gotten there yet, but there's different nations that preferred different patterns, or a pattern that they liked. And once the fur traders in that area were able to understand what their clients, their customers wanted, they would have that item made in something that would be recognizable to them. Now the Haudenosaunee, or the Six Nations people, there's a lot of, we see a lot of Masonic Lodge influence in some of their later, silverware. And again, a fellow in the Detroit region, Fort Malden, Amherstburg, he mentions in his, Isaac Weld mentions in his travels about trade silver and some nations preferring certain patterns, which would be an identifier for anybody that would happen upon a group, seeing them wear perhaps something with a Masonic emblem, or something is unique like this, which may be recognized, perhaps that looks like Six Nations. So, and of course, as soon as you would start talking to the individual, you would certainly know what nation he was part of.
It was a kind of an identifier as well, eh?
Yes, yeah, in some instances, for sure.
So I don't think I'll be giving up my day job, Jerry, when I look at some of the quality of this trade silver, but it was a learning experience. I look forward to making more. But I'm also observing here, it's not always a symbol such as a dragonfly or a moon, but we also have European influence in this trade silver, in this case Scottish.
Yeah, the Lockenbooth, which is primarily a heart-shaped brooch, and in this case the two hearts, signifying love. Always, when you're wearing that, perhaps a young woman might give that to her her favorite beau, or vice versa, so that no matter where they traveled, their hearts were always joined as one. But the Northwest Company having a lot of Scottish
right there, you see that influence. Traders,
we start to see that influence, and you sometimes see the crowns as well. On that jewelry as well. Now you mentioned, I just wanted to get back to something you mentioned, that you thought this was crude. There is over time we saw some native influence where the native individuals started to make their own jewelry, and in archaeological digs we see trade silver repurposed, armbands repurposed into wristbands, and into things like earrings. So nothing went to, you might think that your attempt was crude, but it's actually not too bad at all.
You're so kind, Jerry. You're so kind. Back to that influence too, you might think of Irish harp was one of the ones, right? Yeah. And we think of the Irish influence of Sir William Johnson counseling on his front lawn. Yeah, this is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. In regards to Sir William Johnson, now we're talking 7 Years' War, as it's known in Canada, and in the States, the French-Indian War. The need for allies, in this case, the native allies, was such that the British catered to them. Whatever they needed, they gave. And when it came to the silver works, it was. There was never enough.
No expense.
No expense was spared, much to the government's chagrin, because they often complain about the cost of the goods given to the First Nations people. But again, you had to know your customer, and Sir William Johnson not only cemented relations by being a good trader, but by intermarrying with Molly Brant, which also again cemented those relationships, both through military alliance and through the trade.
Absolutely,
for sure.
before we leave trade silver and get on to some of the other trade items, I have to show my trade shirt, because in the 3.5 years we've been filming the Woodland Escape, I have had 1,000 questions. What's that stuff you're wearing on your shirt? And it was worn by Europeans as well, particularly on the frontier. I think Long Hunter comes to mind. The voyageurs wore it. It could be used as currency if you needed it. You could trade it back into the trading post. But maybe we could step over where there's a little more light. You could demonstrate a shirt here, and we'll talk about how significant this particular bit of trade silver was.
Sure. Well, again, all this silver had to be worn, and there's different ways that it was worn. And on a typical trade shirt, ruffled linen ruffled trade shirt, we can see that it was worn in some ways almost like you would envision chainmail. On the chest, over the coming down the shoulders, over the wrists, and so on. And of course, the ring brooches, as Peter mentioned, was probably the most common trade silver brooch that you saw. And again, came in different sizes, could be used in decorated clothing, from shirts to breech clouts, to whatever the individual thought needed a little bit of bling, I suppose.
Again, we're seeing this circle. We're seeing the continuous continuum of life, Mother Earth, and all the significance that had to the native people. Yeah.
During the War of 1812, William Claus, who was the head of the BID in the Niagara region, he complained after the Battle of the Thames, when all of the British native allies came from the western regions and were at Burlington Heights. There wasn't enough food to feed everybody, the military and the native allies. And Claus mentions that they've sold all their silver to buy as much food as they can, and now they have no silver to wear or buy food with. So they're absolutely in a bad way.
Should point out that BID is the British Indian Department.
Correct.
Significant, played a significant role in getting that ally to trade with them, to attract them into fighting for them, with them.
And maintaining that military alliance, right, stemming back from the time of William Johnson and even before. And trade silver, of course, linen shirts, ruffled shirts, we see on trade lists from fairly early times. The same items are repeatedly given, to the point where they have an identifier, a little sheet of what a chief, a standing chief, is normally given as a gift. Ruffled shirt, Stroud material, leggings, breech clout, and so on. And then the wife of a chief, what she's given, and the warrior, and so on, right down. So no, it was well thought out, and everything had a purpose. The ring brooches, of course, played a significant role. They're often found in our archaeological digs as well, because they were so common. Jeremy Bigsby, a British officer, I believe he was a surgeon, was part of the group when the border was decided upon after the War of 1812. And he took part in a gift-giving or distribution of the annual presents at Drummond Island, and he paddled over from Michilimackinac with Chief Jean-Baptiste de Saganac, and he writes in his journal that both the women and men wore trade shirts, some of them with as many as 500 and 600 brooches covering their shirts, the back, and the weight. He thought it was quite a spectacle, reminded him of chainmail.
There are a few sketches from the time period too, even into the 1700s, showing war chiefs head to toe.
Head to toe.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, let's step over here, and before we leave trade silver, talk a bit maybe about the manufacturers. I read an account, you probably know all the information, but trade silver manufacturer in Quebec City that employed somewhere between 50 and 60 engravers alone. And you probably know his name.
Well, Robert Cruikshank was probably the most prevalent silversmith.
I knew you know the name.
In Montreal. And something that very few people realize is that these silversmiths weren't just making, especially a fellow like Cruikshank, they weren't just making silver for the fur trade, for native use. They were also making items like chalices and so on for churches, silver plates and spoons and so on. So we see their work is widespread. And we mentioned about having a touch mark. You would often see the maker's stamp on the piece of silver, so you can identify. We can even now, of course, because these silversmiths had to be sort of registered with the government, we can identify Robert Cruikshank's mark, Charles Arnaldi's mark, Pierre, you get Latour, his mark, the Widow Schindler, and Crispin Fuller, and John Orkney. That's a John Orkney hat band. Yeah, so it's fascinating that their work is still seen, and it's still valued today as much as it was 200 years ago.
And being reproduced. It's worth too noting that I'm fast forwarding, our persona is 1750s, but if we get into the 1800s, and we've got this rivalry between the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Trade Company. Now the Hudson Bay Company want to get rid of this. They don't want this as a trade item simply because of the cost.
It's expensive.
And the costs are going up like it does nowadays.
Yeah.
The Northwest Trade Company, on the other hand, decided, no, we're going to keep this. And there was a couple of years in there where all of a sudden the indigenous peoples went, well, we're not going to trade with Hudson Bay Company. It was a big business mistake, if you would. So they all brought their furs into the Northwest Company. And I think it's 1821, am I right? 23?
The merger.
The merger.
1821.
And so in the interim, Hudson Bay brought back in trade silver to get back that trade, and as soon as they merged, they dropped trade silver, and that's where you see the end of an era, basically.
Yeah, the greatest peak for trade silver would be from the Revolutionary War, you know, the forming of the Northwest Company, right up until the merger. We do see on some Hudson Bay Company lists in the late 1790s, we see trade silver jewelry. Some are marked actually in the Peter Fiddler list. He makes a note of crosses, silver, crosses plated. So they will sell a cross that's sterling silver, but they'd much rather sell you one that's made out of, that's plated, that's cheap. But after the merger, you're right. They were never, the HBC was never a big fan of trade silver, although they were forced to kind of by the Northwest Company to dabble in it before the merger. But afterwards, anything they did make was almost always German silver, and it soon dwindled dwindled out of fashion.
I want to put a couple of myths aside. So we have a trade musket here. This is early English. The Northwest trade musket, you own a couple yourself. But you hear people talking about when they came into trade for these, that they would trade beaver pelts stacked flat, had to be the height of the musket in order to get one of these from a trading post. And well, we know that's totally inaccurate.
Exactly. The value of a beaver, usually referred to as made beaver, it varied over a time period as competition increased and so on and so forth. But the significance of a gun and a blanket, to a degree, was pretty close as far as what they were valued at in beaver. But they were never, again, the height of a gun.
The other thing, we think of this as the thing that a native would come in and trade very quickly for. But talking with the historical researchers at Fort William in northwestern Ontario, it was the one item they gave away. Now, not always. They were bought and sold, but it was not uncommon for a native to come in with no pelts and he needing a gun, and they'd say, here it is. Yet it would be the most expensive item in the trading post. But what it did according to the historian, and it makes a lot of sense, is it enslaved the natives to that fort. They didn't have the skills or the tools to repair. They needed lead, they needed flints, so it kept bringing them back into that fort. So it was you know, something that was done quite frequently in that time period.
Yeah, you're right, and it's not that the different fur companies didn't know the value of the gun. You see on their lists, and they tell you what that gun costs them. So, of course, the equivalent in beaver pelts would be reflected, but in order to get a beaver pelt, if you give your customer a trap and a gun, it's going to come back. It's good business.
This is a good trade,
right?
This is a good trade.
And on that note, the British Indian Department would give guns to the chiefs and the warriors. We see on their list that's another thing that's given to them. So they knew if they were in an area in the Great Lakes where there's a British post, and they would annually give them what they refer to as presents. They knew that the chief knew that he's going to get a gun once a year for sure. Whether, you know, if he doesn't want it, that's fine. But he's going to take it. And again, not only for beavers, but as a military, you know, if you want a military ally, they're a lot better if they're armed.
Correct. Right,
with something that you're using, and every fort had an armorer and a smith that would repair the native guns for them if they need be, and supply them with ball and shot, different sizes.
With Gerry's beautiful display of trade silver here, it's kind of hard to see what's underneath it, but we're going to move on to textiles and the importance of it in the fur trade. And maybe we can start to talk about these beautiful trade blankets. And
sure.
I'll leave it to you to explain what we have here.
When we look at the trade lists and what was wanted or requested or needed, we see that textiles by far is number one. And textiles is anything from the blankets to material, sprouting material, ribbons, and molten cloths. The list is endless. The blankets in particular, of course, the most common sizes for a time were the 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, and 3, of course. So anything from the youngest child up to an adult, being the 3-point. And again, these were used as blankets, and could be made into capotes. Some are blanket capotes we see, and all hand woven, of course, coming from England, or Old England, I should say.
But these weren't. These were hand woven by?
Well, the fellow that made these is a fellow by the name of Robert Stone, and he hand weaves these blankets. He's spent 50 years studying, and he continues to this day to research. And he probably, in my opinion, makes the most authentic blanket.
Absolutely. I can't get over the thickness. Like, I have a number of Hudson Bay blankets, modern in terms of their production or manufacturing, but the thickness of that fur or wool, I can just, I gotta get me one of those 3-pointers. I keep my old bones warm in the winter when I trek.
The French also made blankets as well, and we see on lists there's different pricing. But once the French Indian War kind of came to an end, and we saw the importance of the French dwindling to, you know, and overtaken by their British counterparts, we see the greater quantity is coming from England. And again, when you mention HBC, we happen to see over a period of time the blanket evolves. So what was the size of a 3-point blanket
then versus
now has changed.
The other interesting thing, we should, again, to dispel some myths, like it's just assumed that that, you know, 1 bar was a beaver pelt, this was 1.5, but we know that prices vary, just like they do in our modern world. And the price for this might go up or down depending on what they were getting for beaver plumes in England or France. And to give you an idea, we'll see, again, I'll focus on the British Indian Department, because their main focus on the items they distributed were strictly for native
use. So we'll see on lists of 3-point blankets 500 pairs. You know, then the next size down, 2.5 point, we'll see 300 pairs. And so you can see how widely they're being distributed. And the Indian Department was based in, I shouldn't say base, but that Indian Department was at every fort, usually a representative was in every fort, from Montreal right out west to Mackinac and Green Bay and so on. So these blankets covered a huge geographical area, much like the silver items as well.
I have to give you a hats off again to your research, because one of the things I like when you post, you get all these trade lists and you post them, and one can glean so much from it. You can extrapolate a little bit, but for the most part, they're speaking plain English. This is how many they sent. This is what they cost in those days, dollars. And speaking of dollars, while we're on it, why don't we talk a little bit about this guy?
Sure.
And because we're talking what we see on this table, whether it's material, fabric, or trade silver, there wasn't a lot of hard currency, and we get into, well, I'm going to let you explain there.
Sure. Of course, getting up into the upcountry, nobody had hard currency or paper currency with them. So not only the trade system, the barter system, but if you did happen upon anybody with hard currency, I like to tell people the Spanish dollar was recognized
all over
North America and
French,
perhaps
English.
The world, right? Because it was guaranteed, and its value never went down. It remained the same. So what's a person to do if they had a Spanish dollar with them if they wanted to buy something that only cost a minimal amount? If I was to give you a Spanish dollar, you'd look at me like I had 3 heads. What am I supposed to do with
I'm
this?
not making change.
I don't have any change. So what was common to do, and people will recognize it as a Hollywood thing, but the term pieces of 8. And all that refers to is a Spanish dollar cut into 8 pieces. And the pieces were referred to as bits. And I'm sure I know my father and your father as well probably mentioned when we brought back a treasure, he might look at it and say that's not worth 2 bits.
Heck, I'm a frugal side. I'm still saying it. That ain't worth 2 bits.
And
I'm a tough trader.
That comes right back from the bits of the Spanish dollar. 2 bits made a quarter. And it's interesting, again, I referred to the War of 1812 because that's sort of my main focus. There's an American surgeon that went with the American fleet after 1812 to try and retake Fort Michilimackinac from the British. And he mentions during his time in Detroit, where they stopped for a few days, he went over to the Canadian side to try and find some fresh vegetables. He was a doctor, so he knew that it was important to have the vegetables and so on. And he mentions a couple things. One thing was that he could hardly find anybody over in Canada that, in the modern-day Windsor, that could speak English or would speak English. They all would speak French to this American. And none of them wanted to sell to him. And when he bought something, the fella he bought the vegetables for pulled out of his pocket a whole pile of these pieces of 8 to try and tell the surgeon how much the vegetables were. And this surgeon mentioned that he thought how backward these people are, that they're still using this sort of thing as currency. But it's kind of funny. The Spanish dollar was still recognized as late as 1850 as a legal tender in the United States, because it took that long for the United, after the Rev War, you become a country, but it takes a long time to get your infrastructure, and that that was solid currency, so it was legal tender right up to about 1850.
They produced during the Continental Army or the American Revolution, they produced what they called Continentals, which was their own dollar.
Their own, yeah.
Well, due to inflation, a year or two after, they're absolutely useless. And Washington and his Congress want to buy them all back in, and they bought them back at 1% of their face value. So it shows you what to do.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to other items. So we got broadcloth, we got wool, we got bolts of linen, and all those good things.
Silk handkerchiefs.
We should show that in a moment. But we also get into knives, pots, kettles, axes, and they're all before we think of this as the number one, but this is number one. Then I'm thinking knives and kettles. Stone Age people all of a sudden building birch bark canoes. I know the value of a really good crooked knife, and that's a grand one. It might be missing when you go home. Can't guarantee that one won't be. So yeah, you can talk maybe a little bit about other trade items.
Sure. The useful items like knives, and you see kettles. The knives were brought in by the thousands. Usually you see them listed by the gross. So a gross is 144 of any one item, a dozen. So of course the red-handled scalping knife. Later on lists we see it called just a butcher's knife. But these were distributed, sold, traded by the thousands.
Tens of thousands of them.
Yeah. And they did evolve a little bit too in size and shape.
We should bring up the maker and give a little note to who made these blades.
These two particular knives were made by a fellow by the name of Ken Hamilton. And Ken Hamilton has, again, another one of these fellas that has spent his lifetime researching and trying to reproduce something that was spot on.
He also made this blade.
He made that little clasp knife.
Yeah. And often it was a very common item to be carried in shooting bags or haversacks.
Yeah, it was commonly you saw these used for cutting everything. It's like your Swiss Army knife, your jackknife in your pocket, right down to pipe tamper. Because they often cut their tobacco into smaller pieces.
When I'm trekking, if I can find one tool that does 2 or 3 or 4 things, that's the tool I carry. If I can find multi-purpose things. Let's talk briefly. I'll just hand you this, and you can talk about silk as another thing that the natives just absolutely loved.
That's right. Yeah, it was. Well, silk is silk. You know, when you get the real product. It's got so many good qualities. It's light, it's airy, but at the same time it can keep you warm. And getting back to the trade silver for a minute, often in the Great Lakes areas, we would see the silk handkerchiefs used as a bandana around their head, decorated with the trade silver buckles as well.
We almost forgot, Gerry, because you got to tell a wee bit of history behind, I'm assuming it's called a chief's hat.
Indeed, it's a chief's hat. We mentioned earlier that the British Indian Department and William Johnson and the French, everybody would give the deserving chiefs or principal men an outfit of clothing, usually a red coat and done in lace.
And obviously elaborate.
Exactly, and a hat that was laced, right? Whether whether it be tricorn and then into round hats and so on. Again, a status symbol, easily recognized, and the guy that's wearing this obviously was important. And as far as the longevity of some of these items for chiefs goes, lace hats and lace coats, they span almost 200 years of use. So a laced hat remained a piece of clothing or an item that was given to a chief well into the 1920s. So
symbolic.
Gives you an idea. That's right. It's as a symbol, it remained that for many, many years.
Fascinating, Gerry. So you're going to stay and join me for a meal?
I am, sir.
We're going to cook up there. I'm getting a little hungry. So, as I mentioned at the start, Gerry's amazing knowledge, and he shared such a wee bit of it today. I mean, we could, I talked earlier, we could do an entire day just on trade silver, but Anyway, the other thing I should point out before Jerry leaves, and I'm going to try to entice him back, is he's a storyteller. And if you watched us, I like a good story. And Jerry related a story once to me. We were up at Nancy Island at a historic event. And Jerry related the story of a fellow by the name of Livingston. And that story, not only did you tell it well, but the story is fascinating, and maybe we can entice you back if I feed you well enough, right? Give you a libation, I can entice you back to tell the story about Livingston.
It's getting better all the time.
I'll bet it does, yeah. You have to pay particular attention when Jerry tells a story, especially the parts he makes up. So anyway.
Those are the best parts.
Shall we cozy up to that fire and get some victuals cooking?
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Cheers.